One late summer's day, Astrid was getting ready for her date with her boyfriend John. They were just going to go for a bit of a walk in nature, so she put on a nice white summer dress, some nice flat sandals to be practical, and she went downstairs and she waited for him. And when John turned up, it was a bit weird because he was all in black with some like serious walking boots. So she questioned this, and he just said, "Oh, well, you know, I like to be prepared." And she thought, "Oh, well, maybe we're going for a bit more of a walk than I thought we were, but, you know, fine, let's carry on." So they went for a walk through the fields where they could hear the birds chirping, feel the sun on their face, they could smell the smell of fresh mown grass. It was all lovely until Astrid heard a noise coming from the woods. It sounded like a whimpering, like someone may be hurt. And she mentioned this to John, and he was a bit dismissive, and he said, "Oh, you know, I don't think we should go, and I've heard weird things about those woods." But she was insistent, so they went in, and John said, "That's fine, we can go in, but I'll go first so I can look after you." Astrid agreed to this, although she wasn't particularly happy. So they went round, and it seemed like they were walking for ages and ages and ages, and it felt like they were walking in circles, and they were just about to give up when Astrid spotted a cabin in the woods, and it seemed to be where the noise was coming from. So she ran forward, she opened the door, she went in, and there was someone there, barely alive, hanging up by a meat hook with blood dripping down their body and then dripping off their face onto the floor. Astrid was disgusted, and she screamed and screamed and screamed. She couldn't see John anywhere until the door slammed, and he was there in front of the locked door holding a knife. And the last words Astrid heard John say were, "I'm sorry."
One late summer evening, Astrid was getting ready for her date with her boyfriend John. She put on a white dress, some sensible flat shoes, and she was preparing to go out for a wander in the pleasant evening, just around in the woods nearby. And John came to pick her up, but John was wearing some black clothes, combat boots, and looked a little bit unusual. So Astrid asked John, "Why have you dressed like that?" And John said, "Oh, you know, I just like to be prepared for anything." And so Astrid shrugged it off, and they left on their walk. As they were wandering along, they were listening to the birds tweeting, the sound of the breeze in the trees. It was beautiful. However, Astrid heard a strange whimpering noise coming from the woods, and pointed it out to John. John didn't hear it, so he was quite dismissive, and he said it's best not to go into the woods that way because they can be a bit creepy sometimes. So they carried on, but Astrid was persistent that she could hear something. So she gradually convinced John to go with her into the woods, and they started wandering through these dark woods. And they were walking for hours, it seemed, and they were going round and round in circles, occasionally hearing this strange noise. And so finally they came across a cabin in the woods, and Astrid heard some more whimpering coming from inside, so she knew this was the place. John followed behind her as she entered into the cabin, and just inside she saw she saw a man that was hardly alive. He was hanging upside down on one of the walls on a meat hook, with his guts busted out of his stomach, dribbling down towards his chin, and blood running over his face. And he was begging for her to help. But suddenly the door closed behind her, and John stood there with a knife. And all he could say to his partner Astrid was, "I'm sorry."
So this is the story about Astrid and John. So Astrid was getting ready to go on a date with John, which her partner. It was a late summer's evening, and she was getting ready. She was putting on a white dress with some sensible flat shoes. And then when John come to pick her up, she saw that he was dressed in combat trousers and boots. I think they were black. And it was really unusual for him to be wearing these clothes. So Astrid said, "Why are you wearing them?" And he said that he'd just like to be prepared. She thought nothing more of it, and they went for their walk. She just shrugged it off, and off they went. And then when they were in the woods on their walk, they heard the birds tweeting and the breeze in the trees. And then she also heard a whimper. And she said to John about the whimpering, but he couldn't hear it. He said it was best not to go in the woods because it was creepy. But she was adamant about this whimpering, and she kept on pestering John until he agreed to go into the woods with her. And they were walking through the woods. They went for hours and hours, walked in circles. It was probably getting dark by that point. And then they came across a cabin, and the strange whimpering seemed to be coming from inside. So Astrid went in, and she found a man who was barely alive. He was hanging upside down from a meat hook against a wall, and there was blood on him and dribble coming down his chin. Poor bugger. And he was begging for help, like he really wanted help. And then all of a sudden Astrid heard the door close, and she turned around, and there stood John with a knife. And all he could say was, "I'm sorry."
Okay, this is the story of Astrid and John, and they were getting ready to go on a date, or Astrid was getting ready to go on a date with John, and she was getting dressed in like a nice white dress and some shoes that matched it, and they were going to go on a date. So she got all dressed up, and John turns up, and he's wearing sort of combat gear, camouflage trousers and stuff, which she thought was a bit strange for John to be dressed like that. But she just shrugged it off because he said he liked to be prepared. And so anyway, they end up going on a date, and she is it's like a Tuesday evening in summer, a nice evening, and they go for a walk, and they can hear birds tweeting in the trees and all sort of nice peaceful noises. And when after a while Astrid hears a whimpering, and she wants to investigate the noise, but John seems adamant that he kind of wants to ignore it because the woods aren't safe and stuff. But she is adamant that she does want to go and find out what it is. So in the end, John says, "Yeah, okay, fuck it, we'll go." And they go walking through the woods trying to find this whimpering noise, and it takes hours and hours, and they're out roaming around for about 3 hours, and they have no idea where they are, and they're lost, and they're walking in circles. When eventually the whimpering gets louder, and they bump into a cottage in the woods, or a little cabin in the woods. And Astrid goes up to it, and she opens the door, and she sees this man. He's all beaten up and bloody, hanging upside down from a meat hook, and he's all covered in blood, and he's dribbling from the face. Dribbling from the face? He is dribbling, and it's just moving up his face or whatever. Anyway, so yeah, this man hanging upside down, all bloody and dribbling on a meat hook, and all she hears is the door slam behind her, and she turns around, and John is there with a knife, and all he can say to her is "I'm sorry." Yeah, sorry it's so long. Good luck.
So, this is a story about a girl named Astrid and someone called John, and they had a plan to go out on a date one night. So, while Astrid was getting ready, she was dressed in this white dress, I think, and she was looking quite nice and all dolled up for her night out, and she went downstairs to meet John, who was dressed in combat gear, and she thought he looked quite weird, but she went along with it and decided to go on the date anyway. So they went for a walk in the forest. I think they went for a walk, and they had a good time, and it was a nice summery Tuesday evening, and the weather was quite warm, I think, and it was a good evening. When they were walking through the woods, and Astrid heard a whimpering noise, and she was adamant that she wanted to go and find out what it was, but John was kind of more reluctant and was like, no, don't want to do that. So in the end he gave up and agreed to go with her. So they went into the woods and started searching for the whimpering noise for about 3 hours, and they had no idea where they were. They got lost. They had lost the path that they were on, trying to find this whimpering noise, when they finally came across a cottage in the middle of the woods, and Astrid ran up to it and went inside and saw that there was this man hanging from a meat hook, and he was very bloody, and there was blood dribbling down his face. He was upside down, and he looked quite beaten up and gross. The door slammed behind her, and she turned around, and John was there, and all he said was, "I'm sorry." And that's as much as I remember. Sorry.
Okay, so this is a story about Astrid and a boy called John. They were going to go on a date. So Astrid was getting ready, and she put on a pretty white dress, and she got all dolled up for a night out. And then John turned up to pick her up for the date, and he was dressed in like camos, I think. And she thought it was weird because he looked really odd, and they were meant to be going on a nice date, but she just went, oh, okay, whatever. And then they went for a walk in the forest, and they were walking for 3 hours, and they lost their path, and they didn't. It was a warm, sunny Tuesday, so it was quite nice. They were just walking for hours and then lost their path. And then they could hear, Astrid heard like a whimpering sound, and she said to John, "Can you hear that?" And he was like, yeah, let's leave it. And she was like, no, I want to go and find it. I want to go and see what that noise is. So then they walked for ages again, trying to find this noise. And eventually they came upon a cottage, and Astrid ran into the cottage to see if the noise was coming from there. And when she got inside, she saw a man hanging from a meat hook, and blood everywhere, and dribbling blood, and he looked like he'd been beaten up and wasn't doing good, whimpering. I don't know if she went and tried to help, but then she heard a slam behind her, a door slam behind her, and she turned around and John was there, and all he could say was, "I'm sorry. Stay out of the woods."
So this is a story about Astrid and John. They met on Tinder, and they met up for their date. It was a sunny Tuesday, and Astrid was getting ready, tarting herself up, getting on the va-va-voom, and John turned up, and it was quite strange because he was wearing all camo, which kind of put a little bit of a weird one, because Astrid thought it was going to be a lavish date, dinner, wine and dine and all of that. But they ended up going for a walk, and they were walking in a nice foresty kind of atmosphere, and you know, it got thicker and thicker, kind of turned more into a woods. They were just walking along. It'd been 3 hours or so, and they were just walking, having a chat, you know, first date jitters and all that, finding out if they had siblings. Then they were walking, and Astrid heard some sort of whimpering, and she turned around and said to John, "Can you hear that?" And he was like, "Oh, let's just leave it, let's just carry on with our nice little sunny walk." And she was like, "No, we've got to go and find it." She obviously wants to be a hero and go and save an injured animal. John should understand. So then they walked for a very long time, and there was a cottage. So Astrid ran over to this cottage because the whimpering got louder, and as she burst through the door, there was a man on a meat hook, blood everywhere. He'd obviously been beaten up severely, and Astrid tried to help him get off this meat hook, and then the door slammed and John was standing there, and he said, "I'm sorry, you shouldn't walk in the woods."
One late summer's day, Astrid was getting ready for her date with her boyfriend John. They were just going to go for a bit of a walk in nature, so she put on a nice white summer dress, some nice flat sandals to be practical, and she went downstairs and she waited for him. And when John turned up, it was a bit weird, because he was all in black with some like serious walking boots. So she questioned this, and he just said, "Oh, well, you know, I like to be prepared." And she thought, "Oh, well, maybe we're going for a bit more of a walk than I thought we were, but you know, fine, let's carry on." So they went for a walk through the fields where they could hear the birds chirping, feel the sun on their face, they could smell the smell of fresh mown grass. It was all lovely until Astrid heard a noise coming from the woods. It sounded like a whimpering, like someone may be hurt. And she mentioned this to John, and he was a bit dismissive, and he said, "Oh, you know, I don't think we should go, and I've heard weird things about those woods." But she was insistent, so they went in, and John said, "That's fine, we can go in, but I'll go first so I can look after you." Astrid agreed to this, although she wasn't particularly happy. So they went round, and it seemed like they were walking for ages and ages and ages, and it felt like they were walking in circles, and they were just about to give up when Astrid spotted a cabin in the woods, and it seemed to be where the noise was coming from. So she ran forward, she opened the door, she went in, and there was someone there, barely alive, hanging up by a meat hook with blood dripping down their body and then dripping off their face onto the floor. Astrid was disgusted, and she screamed and screamed and screamed. She couldn't see John anywhere until the door slammed, and he was there in front of the locked door holding a knife. And the last words Astrid heard John say were, "I'm sorry."